Tiananmen Square is the very heart of China, a country which over recent decades has come along in leaps and bounds. But here there are ghosts. A brutal crackdown 25 years ago in and around the square has been wiped from the country's official memory.
During Tiananmen, after the students had been killed, maybe a week later, I went back to the embassy and one of our local staff there actually held me and was crying on my shoulder. What are they doing to our children? What are they doing to our children?
Yet there are those who are on the front line and who until now haven't spoken publicly about this dark chapter. They're the men and women of the Australian Embassy in Beijing. They watched as hope turned to horror, and on the anniversary of this bloody crackdown, they've assembled to tell of what they saw, who they helped and harboured, even playing a key role in getting images out to a global audience.
Part of the problem, as I always thought, was that, they didn't know how to use a fire hose. Perhaps they didn't have fire hoses, but that was the way to disperse that without any problem if you were a government, done in hundreds of countries before and since. You get a bit of a demonstration, hose them down and, do all that. You don't need to shoot them.
In early June 1989, a cable is sent through from the Australian Embassy in Beijing to Foreign Affairs in Canberra, detailing the brutal crushing of a protest movement to keep the government in power. Its shocking contents will move a Prime Minister to tears.
Moved in to push the remains into piles.
It was all a long way from the heady days just months earlier, when tens of thousands of students descended on the square to use the death of Liberal Communist Party figure Hu Yaobang to call for a freer, fairer China.
Word came out that he had died. And remember, in Beijing in those days, almost no one had telephones. It was strange how news and information was communicated, almost as if there were tom-toms beating, but suddenly the word spread, and there was this real sense of loss.
Jeff Raby was economic counsellor. He says he and other colleagues defied the ambassador's orders not to go down to the square because they couldn't stay away from this historic event.
I happened to be there on the night that the Goddess of Democracy was erected, and that was a scary event because the students smuggled into the square little bits of the statue, which looked very much like the Statue of Liberty, and built it in the square near where the current flagpole is. I remember being there very, very worried that this was the moment that something violent would happen from the authorities.
Is that because it was such a challenge
Absolutely.
to the authorities?
Utter provocation. And not only because it was called the Goddess of Democracy, but the reference so explicitly to the US was an utter challenge, provocation.
It was a very exciting mood, a sense of change, experiment, creativity.
Nick Jose was cultural counsellor at the embassy. It was his job to make contact with Chinese artists, writers and thinkers. Key intellectuals and students would drift down to his apartment after a day of protesting.
My flat became a bit of a place where people would hang out and discuss what was going on, talk about new ideas, exchange gossip. And
drink, party?
Yeah, we had a good stock of Australian wine. Red wine was very popular. We had the Bega cheese in the fridge and the fillet steak that had been cryo-packed and sent up.
they all watched as the army began to enter the city in preparation to take on the students.
Our apartment and the balconies on our apartment overlooked the second ring road around which the student protests, particularly the huge one of several 100,000 people, marched. And we were overlooking that, the big one. We were watching it for hours and hours, and the people were very happy. They were rather joyous.
Air Force Group Captain Peter Everett was Defence Attaché in Beijing. He worked with his colleagues from other Western embassies to collect intelligence on the troop build-up as hundreds of thousands of soldiers arrived.
There were two basically military transport airfields, one in the north and one in the south. The Americans looked at the one in the south and I went to the one in the north. I was able to actually drive onto it. It wasn't walled like the one in the south. And when the troops started arriving, they were country boys from, peasants basically, and even though they guarded the roads onto the airfield, I was able to drive up and say, look, I'm in Chinese, I'm just going down to see the aircraft museum down here. And they'd look at me and I'd just drive past.
And I did that drive onto the airstrip, is
onto
that
the
right?
Airstrip, drive around the airstrip, count the aircraft, the trucks, the tents, get an idea of how many troops there were who'd moved in. I was able to do that a couple of times. Then one day when I drove up, I was stopped by an obvious military policeman who was a local. Instead of the rifle, he had a sidearm, and he told me to bugger off, basically, and I did. I didn't go back again.
I mean, it was just an extraordinary period.
David Hanna was working alongside the Defence Attaché, who taught him how to read military number plates to identify the origin of a battalion.
It was interesting as we got closer to June 4 and afterwards, there were military vehicles moving around which had covered up their number plates to make sure that nobody knew who they were.
Well, the balconies were very nicely constructed out of concrete with gaps between the pillars, and so you could lie on the balcony and take photos.
David Hanna's wife, Harriet Mantel, was immigration officer at the embassy. She too was collecting intelligence.
You'd see a truck coming down the street or a couple of trucks with some soldiers in it. It would very quickly be surrounded. Suddenly, out of nowhere, people would appear. They would stop the truck. The soldiers usually left, and then people would stuff a rag into the petrol tank and light it and set fire to the truck.
People who lived in the alleyways or hutongs were giving soldiers drinks and cigarettes, but also lecturing them and asking them to leave.
I spoke to a group. There were no students. They were all local residents from the hutongs mainly. And I asked them what they thought the army would do, and they said, the army can't do anything. We've immobilised them. Look here. They can't move. If they want to have a piss, they've got to ask our approval. I spoke to one unit, the soldiers of one unit. They were basically peasants. They were from Sichuan. They couldn't believe that a city could be so wealthy. And they saw the students who were sent to university at the party's expense by the party, and they thought that the students were dreadfully ungrateful people.
At one stage, hundreds of unarmed troops jogged down the main avenue.
As we came to the back street, there were military trucks and ambulances, and soldiers who'd obviously been beaten up were coming down the street, being filmed bleeding before being put into a truck and bandaged and so on.
I believe that was just another ploy by the party to gain the sympathy of the People's Liberation Army, the PLA.
The protesters had one key supporter in the Politburo, Zhao Ziyang. He'd soon be under house arrest for the remainder of his life, but used his final hours of liberty in a failed attempt to convince the students that they'd done enough and to leave the square. It was about to get bad.
We'd heard that something was happening, and we tore down Chang'an at a huge speed. And it was very interesting that the police didn't do anything. I had the hazard lights going. I was going about twice the speed limit.
Gregson Edwards was the embassy media officer. On the afternoon of the 3rd of June, he arrived at a street to the west of Tiananmen Square to witness one last defiant action by the protesters.
When we arrived there, everyone was... all the soldiers were seated. There was 200 or 300 of them, and then they were ringed by all the students and ordinary citizens. I don't know what the student leaders were saying to them, but they had a megaphone, and they were obviously berating them, and they were all hanging their heads. I've got a photograph of them all hanging their heads. They're just all hanging their heads. And I gather that they were just told to be ashamed of themselves and that they were turning on their fellow citizens.
We went to see Chai Ling and Wara Casey, the two major student leaders, near the Heroes Monument. And that's when Chai Ling told us, crying, that that night the soldiers would come, that there would be a lot of bloodshed, that a lot of people would die. And that was really the first time I had considered that the soldiers would use lethal force and not simply act as riot police.
There was now a sense of inevitability about the awful climax to come. At around 11 p.m, the PLA started shooting.
We heard the sound of heavy firing, concentrated firing, and saw tracer bullets going through the sky.
Armoured personnel carriers, or APCs, were in the initial wave of attack.
We saw the first APC come tearing into the square.
One APC from the south actually got through well ahead of its mates, and reached the square all alone. They seemed to have been very confused.
It ended up crashing into some barriers, and at that point, the crowd just descended on it.
It was stopped by a crowbar or something like that in the spokes and set alight.
And what happened to the people inside that APC?
They were dead. They were killed, yes.
The soldiers were all just killed by ordinary citizens?
They were burnt alive.
Most students would get out of the square, but the real casualties on that first night would be in the streets leading up to the western side of Tiananmen.
The soldiers appear to have been ordered to get to the square and not to allow anything to stop them. They ran over, I believe, and crushed many people, but they were firing apparently indiscriminately as they came, and the APCs are mounted with machine guns. I went down that road, Fussingmen, a day or so later, and saw on all the bus shelters and in the walls many, many bullet holes, bullet marks at about head level, so that they weren't firing over the people, they were firing into the people.
It's not known how many protesters were shot or crushed to death that night. It's also not known how many soldiers were killed in angry retaliation.
Some I know had their genitals cut off, stuffed in their mouth. They were burned and then hung from overpasses, and I saw 2 of those.
The morning revealed a city in the complete control of the army. As the military was now running the country with satellite uplinks blocked, television images like this would have to be smuggled out to Hong Kong.
I had diplomatic cover, of course, and fortuitously, I'd lost a great deal of weight by going to the gym. And I had this suit which had been made for me before that, and it was a double-breasted pinstripe suit, and it was ideal for taping the cassettes of videotape to my body, or putting them inside my shirt and buttoning it up and looking a little bit tubby, but still in a well-cut suit. and then going straight out through the customs and immigration barrier out to the little pod, the departure lounge, and then accosting people who I thought looked like they'd be brave enough to take this handful of cassettes down to Hong Kong and look for someone waving a sign saying Western television.
In the weeks following the 4th of June, soldiers drove around the city shooting up buildings and rounding up agitators. Peter Everett says this is when most students were killed.
There'd be a knock on the door, 2 a.m, whatever. Security people would demand the release of a student from the family. Often as not, they'd come back 2 hours later and say, sorry, he was shot trying to escape, or he fell down the stairs, or she did this or something, they're dead.
The British ambassador had standing instructions that if anybody sought asylum, he was not to spend the night on the embassy premises.
David Sadleir was Australian ambassador to China throughout the turbulent year of 1989.
But we had no rules about this, so I just made it up as we went along. But I still think we were right. And,
right to protect him?
Yeah, I think we were, yeah.
Taiwanese singer Hu Yaobang was one of the many now in peril. Earlier he'd been the darling of the party after defecting to mainland China. But he went on to support the students, and this changed everything. He'd become friends with Nick Jose.
He was kind of smuggled in under a blanket or something, as I recall, but he got there safely. We were very worried about him, actually.
Did you have to convince people above you to allow him to enter the embassy?
There was discussion of what was happening with the ambassador, with other senior diplomats, and it was decided that this was worth doing.
That Australia would get him out?
Well, that Australia would give him refuge. I mean, he was a friend of Australia, in a sense.
The ambassador held off telling the Chinese government officially that Hu Yaobang was inside the embassy.
Oh, because I thought that the longer we delayed, the more that China would, the more the tensions would fall, the more that China would want to come back into the world community, and the more chance I had of getting him out alive, yeah.
The Chinese Foreign Ministry was informed that he was there, and negotiations began for his eventual, I don't know if release is the word, but...
safe passage?
Safe passage out of the embassy, and then not so safe passage back to Taiwan.
And they put him in a truck, drove him down to Tiananmen, put him on a fishing boat, put him on the beach at Taiwan. That's how he did. And from there he made his way to New Zealand, yes.
Literary critic turned philosopher Liu Yaobang was another of Nick Jose's friends now in grave danger. He'd been advising the students, and he in particular would be sought by the authorities. Yet on the threshold of sanctuary, the man who'd become a globally renowned dissident made a fateful decision.
I took him in my car from my flat to the embassy gates, and I said, well, this is it. We can drive in, the gates will open, and we'll drive in, and the gates will close, and you will have effectively sought asylum from Australia, or you can go and find friends who live nearby, friends I also knew. He thought about it, he looked at me and said, thank you, but no, he would stay in China. He was Chinese. China was his country. China was his fate. And so he went off to find his friends. And it was only later that night, around 11 p.m, that his girlfriend called, really upset on the phone to say they'd been riding their bikes through a dark street and an unmarked van had just come up and had grabbed him and he'd gone.
Did you wish you'd convinced him to come into the embassy?
Yes. I realised that had been a close possibility, and maybe if I'd kind of pushed it a bit harder, that might have happened.
By not seeking asylum, Liu Yaobang chose the toughest of paths. He was arrested, jailed for 2 years and tortured. In 2008, he'd be jailed again, this time for 11 years, for inciting subversion of state power. He went on to win the Nobel Peace Prize from behind bars. It was awarded symbolically to an empty chair. The order came to evacuate the embassy of all but a handful of staff.
I jumped out of the bus thinking I'm going to go to my apartment, I'm going to have as much time as I can to gather bits and bobs.
Kerry Costanzo worked as a stenographer in the embassy. She joined a convoy of minibuses driving to the compounds where people lived to quickly collect clothes in preparation to get out of China.
And just as I'd run out of the bus, but had sort of gone about 20 metres, gunfire, and I'd never heard gunfire before in my life, and it felt like it was all around me. I looked up to see the Defence Attaché and the political counsellor standing at the door of the bus, screaming at me, yelling at me, swearing at me to come back. And I'm going, no, no. And they said, no. Anyway, there was lots of expletives, and they just said, come. So I ran and I dived into the bus, and even the political counsellor will tell you that I dived into his crutch, and it was the safest place I'd felt for a very long time.
What was very moving at that point was going through the back streets to get back to the embassy. Local people coming out and saying, go and tell people what's happening.
That they saw you as outsiders, they wanted to get the word out.
They wanted the word out, yeah.
Days later, the Defence Attaché found 72 bullets in various staff flats, and he was disturbed by the type of ammunition used.
These are some of the bullets I recovered from the Australian apartments.
Okay, well, that looks like it could do you some harm. That's the casing, is it?
That's the casing. That's the core.
Right.
Solid steel. The core is surrounded by lead and then surrounded again by a thin copper sheath, which peels apart like a banana when it hits something. And it cuts through arteries, it cuts through everything it hits. And that explains why we found that so many people that were hit by these bullets during Tiananmen actually bled to death.
Reports started coming in of ever worse atrocities, and one in particular would form the basis of a crucial cable sent through to Australia.
It was a very senior Western journalist who had observed in a laneway behind on the western side of the Great Hall of the People, troops using bulldozers to push all these bodies into a heap, and then dousing them in petrol and burning them.
That's the latest on China.
Then Prime Minister Bob Hawke was receiving constant updates. He couldn't believe what he was hearing.
And children and young girls were slaughtered as mercilessly as the many wounded soldiers from other units there. Anti-personnel carriers and tanks then ran backwards and forwards over the bodies of the slain.
So this is it,
Yep, the old embassy. Whoops.
In this climate, there was frenetic work to be done at the old embassy, which is now the European Union mission. Classified files and secret equipment had to be destroyed before leaving. So it was all hands to the pump.
And do you remember what it was like when the word came through that you had to, get most of the people out of here?
Yeah, well, people had to be mobilised. It was very busy. This courtyard or entrance area here was wide open. So this very spot was the centre of most of the activity. A big part of the job was to remove the files, and files were coming out. Believe it or not, the incinerator was at the front fence over here. And I have this strong recollection of the decoding equipment that we used. It's very primitive in those days, of course, and the decoding equipment was being chopped up with an axe or a sledgehammer
outdoors,
just out next to the incinerator, smashed, and then put into the incinerator and burnt.
That whole morning prior to being tapped on the shoulder in my boiler suit was throwing documents down the incinerator.
In the middle of a pilot's strike, a Qantas 747 staffed by volunteers landed in Beijing to take out any Australians who wanted to leave.
Literally tapped on the shoulder, the buses are ready, we're going. And went downstairs, didn't have time to change, hopped on the bus and landed in Hong Kong in a boiler suit.
I do remember when we finally got on the plane, we took off in an unusually steep way, and the pilot came on the blower just afterwards, said sorry about that, but there was an armed gun emplacement at the end of the runway and I didn't want to take any risks we didn't need to take, so we're getting the hell out of here as quickly as we can.
I think many of my colleagues will tell you that we drank the plane dry by the time we got to Hong Kong.
During a time of massive upheaval, Australia's embassy staff helped protect people in danger, smuggled out footage and spoke out about the atrocities they'd seen. Yet given the crucial economic ties between our countries now, you do wonder if they'd be able to act the same way if these events happened today. Either way, later in 1989, they returned to this post to a country where the government had already shut down any public discussion of the events that year. It's a policy which is still in place today.
What happened in 1989 is that the party lost its kind of mandate of heaven. To use a Chinese term, it lost its moral legitimacy, and it can't get it back without dealing with this in some way.
I think everyone is smart enough to know that one day there'll be an account and a reckoning. But yes, I mean, it's a matter of time.